Hello and welcome to Research Exchange. I'm Laeeq, and today I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Seeger, one of the leading experts in crisis communication. He's worked with the CDC, the World Health Organization, Fortune 500 companies, and he's the author of Theorizing Crisis Communication. Dr. Seeger is a distinguished professor of communication at the Center of Emerging and Infectious Diseases at Wayne State University in Michigan. His work has appeared in more than 200 journal articles, book chapters, and conference proceedings. Dr. Seeger, thank you so much for being here today.
Very happy to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's start with the big picture. When a crisis hits, a pandemic, a natural disaster, an industrial accident, communication can either save lives or cost them. So what makes the difference between crisis messaging that works and messaging that fails?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and in many ways, sort of defines my program of research over the last 40 years or so, trying to identify the components associated with successful crisis communication. We've done a lot of investigation of crisis failures. We have done less looking at what is successful. So, one of the models that we developed, which I think is very useful, is called the best practices framework. This was developed in the late 1990s, some work with some of my colleagues, Tim Salnow and others, looking at 10 best practices that can really inform appropriate and effective crisis communication. So I won't go into great detail on these, but some of these have to do with preparedness, planning. Obviously, planning is absolutely essential. Honesty and openness, something that we need to emphasize more in communication in general, certainly is critical during a crisis situation. Communicating with empathy is very important. Sometimes we feel like we need to be purely objective in a crisis situation and avoid any expressions of empathy because that might create more risk going forward. But empathy is something that audiences expect during crisis. Collaborating with credible sources, coordinating is very important. Recognizing uncertainty and acknowledging the uncertainty. Listening is also important. So there are a variety of different factors which can influence the effectiveness of crisis communication. I would also just note that crisis is not a normal time. It is an abnormal time. And we should not try to communicate during a crisis as we would communicate during normal times. We have to acknowledge the context and understand the context. So those are some general guidelines for how to be more effective in crisis communication.
Great. And while you were speaking, I was taking notes, and indeed, these best practices do matter, such as planning, listening, honesty, openness, empathy. And that foundation really matters because the organization that gets it the right way, they don't usually figure it out on the fly. They're supposed to be looking at it from experience, sometimes painful experiences. Which brings me to your work, your own work at the highest levels of public health. And you worked with the CDC for over a decade, and you served on the WHO, World Health Organization's Guideline Development Group for Emergency Risk Communication. I'm happy to state that I've used those guidelines for my own research as well. So all very beneficial work. So those are two of the most important public health institutions in the world that we just outlined. What are the biggest lessons that those organizations have learned, sometimes the hard way, about talking to a public during a crisis?
Yeah, so the issues of crisis and emergency risk communication around public health are significant, and there are many, many challenges. I think the biggest issue right now with regard to that form of communication or that context of communication is the involvement of politics in some of these discussions. Health communication has become very politicized, and we have a variety of different conflicting guidelines, messages, orientations around issues of public health. Probably the best example of that is in vaccines right now.
Mhm.
So I think that the health organizations have had to learn or trying to learn how to navigate some of those political contexts.
Mhm.
I think the other issues that I would say and I think this is reflected both in the CDC's work and the World Health Organization, is they really embrace these concepts of preparedness and developing plans and developing resources and developing relationships with key audiences, training so that people have the capacity and understand the components associated with crisis communication during an emergency. So they've really embraced some of those components, and I think in general we have created a response capacity, a crisis communication response capacity in public health that was not there 20 years ago. And so that's very reassuring. At the same time, these political forces, plus the emergence of new infectious diseases and reemergence of infectious diseases and population migration, and all of these factors are really making that a very, very complex domain for communication.
Absolutely. And you raise a very important point that I'd like to unpack a little bit regarding the role of politics in health. Because what researchers, what we do in the research world is data and numbers and scientific evidence. And of course, politics has a different take on all some of those things. So especially during COVID, which was a major health crisis, it was communication playing out in real time in front of everyone. So can you touch briefly upon the role of politics and how to navigate that in a situation where we academics are not trained, obviously, from a political sense? What are the best ways that this can be navigated?
Yes, well, I wish I had a simple answer for that particular question. I will say that the research community is ill prepared for dealing with these political issues. And in the crisis and emergency response and risk communication fields, we never ever anticipated that a public health disaster would become a political issue.
Mhm.
Politics have always been part of disaster response, but in general, what we have found is people pull together and they really look for points of connection during a crisis as opposed to points of political advantage. So, I think that going back to some of the best practices I talked about, I think there are fundamental questions about how to communicate to audiences during a crisis, which fill the informational void so that there aren't opportunities for all sorts of interesting explanations and rumors and misinformation to emerge. If we are fully engaged in some of those conversations, then that is less likely to happen in those circumstances. And also, this idea of honesty and accuracy, transparency in a crisis situation. So, one of the things that's been very well documented, particularly in the disaster sociology literature, are a series of myths that we hold about crisis and disasters. And one of the myths that is quite common is that people will panic if we give them the right information. If we tell them what's actually going on, people will panic and they will engage in all kinds of wild, irresponsible, erratic, irrational behavior. But in general, the research shows that that's just doesn't happen. It's very, very rare that we see people engaging in this panic kind of behavior. People generally respond in very rational and responsible ways during a crisis, provided they are given accurate information. If the information is all over the map, it's inconsistent, it's not from credible sources, then we may see behaviors that are less rational in those circumstances. And I have heard politicians, I shall not name them, I have heard politicians say, well, I didn't want to tell people how bad things actually were because had I told them that, they would panic. And I didn't want to see panic. So we have this tendency, I think, in political contexts, often to withhold information from people because of this myth of panic, and that actually makes things much worse. So, in terms of how to communicate within a political context, I don't have all those answers. I would say transparency, honesty, compassion, collaboration, some of those ideas I talked about initially, I think are really important.
Right, absolutely. And it's amazing how different stakeholders in such crisis situations can cannot trust the other side, which is sad. I mean, why are we judging the intellect of the general public when it boils down to the messaging itself? So
Yeah.
speaking of the messaging, and you touched upon a very important point that is very close to my own research. You talked about engaging and filling the information void so that we mitigate the negative impacts of political messaging as well as misinformation that sometimes comes with it. So what would you suggest? What can practitioners in such a situation and researchers do to effectively engage with their audiences? And that's a question that's been studied widely, but from your own research and experience, what would you like to share?
Sure. So I think there are a variety of factors which we know about from many contexts of communication. One is credibility, for example, which is important in these contexts, and it's not necessarily what we would view as the credible source that the audience may view as a credible source. Sometimes the credible source is, the person who's in the neighborhood who we know well and we have a personal relationship. Sometimes the credible source is the subject matter expert. So credibility is really important in terms of messaging in these particular contexts. I think another factor that is important is to acknowledge the uncertainty.
Hmm.
So there's often a tendency that officials feel that they have to say, this is what we know, this is exactly what we know, this is the absolute, we have definitive information about this, when really the circumstances are not that clear. So we advise people to acknowledge the uncertainty so that there's a recognition that the message may change, circumstances may change. So we often say to people, indicate that based on what we currently know, this is what we think is going to happen, or this is what we think caused this particular circumstance. That may change as more information comes available. So we often see people in spokespersons' roles really over reassuring, and that can create problems down the road and undermine the trust that we have between the audience and the source.
True, true. And a related question would be what would be the role of social media as compared to mainstream media when such messaging is being relayed?
Yeah. So social media, wow. We could spend a lot of time talking about social media and crisis communication. It has a variety of really important affordances for effective communication during a crisis. The speed of response is unmatched by legacy media. We can do crowdsourcing of situational awareness. We can promote emergent organizing, which is very important in a crisis situation. So social media plays an incredibly important role and has become an essential tool. It is also, of course, a vector for rumors and misinformation. Rumors typically, we use the term misinformation a lot. In the crisis literature, we've been talking about rumors for a very long time. Rumors emerge when there is inadequate information about an issue that is of significant importance. So if we don't have an explanation, for example, about why a crisis happened, we may start creating those explanations, and social media is a great vector for carrying those rumors and distributing those rumors. And they can go viral, we can have conspiracy theories, and we can go down a variety of different rabbit holes. Clearly, I think most of us, heard some of the wild rumors around COVID-19. If you get vaccinated, it will change your DNA and you will no longer be a human. You will grow a third eye if you get vaccinated. These were just absolutely wild, outrageous explanations for what was going on. So social media is very, very important, and it allows us to do so many really critical things, and it repositions the audience member from sort of a passive participant to passive recipient of messages, warnings, and alerts to a very active participant, a content creator in this process, which really allows us to be much more immediate in understanding what is happening during a crisis.
Absolutely. So you've written about something really compelling. The idea that communities don't just survive crises, they can actually come together You call this renewal. Can you walk us through what post-crisis renewal looks like in practice?
Yeah, so this is a theory that I've developed with some of my colleagues and some of my students over years, and I think it's a really important approach to thinking about crisis. So I need to go back a little bit and talk about the traditional approach to crisis communication. When I began in the field many years ago, crisis communication was always all about image repair and reputational management. It
Mhm.
was about making sure that when my product was recalled or when there was a fire or I happened to spill toxic waste into the local water system, that I wouldn't be held as accountable or wouldn't be blamed as much for that as possible. So I want to mitigate the accusations of wrongdoing. So that was the focus of most of crisis communication work, was to mitigate the reputational harm that would come from a crisis. That's an important question, but as we began looking at some types of crises, we found that that model just didn't work at all. That organizations weren't interested in mitigating the harm. In fact, they wanted to talk about the future. They wanted to talk about what they were going to do to make things better and how they were going to recover and how the community and their companies would be better following this event. So while image repair and image restoration theory talks about what happened in the past, oh, that wasn't really as bad as you thought it was, and I wasn't really responsible for that thing that happened. The discourse of renewal is forward looking. It's looking at the future. Where are we going to go from here? What happens next? So we found a number of cases that were characterized by this kind of discourse. And we look back at some cases and we saw some historic cases that really were about going forward and about change and growth and learning. And so we believe that the discourse of renewal really has an important component. It lends an important component to understanding how organizations and communities can respond to these events. So I talked about the prospective orientation, looking forward, as opposed to a retrospective orientation. We also see discursive renewal as characterized by values, sometimes family values, sometimes supporting those who have been harmed, sometimes community values. These are often manifest in that particular discourse. We also see strong leadership, which is able to offer this prospective vision. This is what the future is going to look like. I'm going to provide this compelling vision of the future. So those are some of the components which characterize the discourse of renewal. It's an interesting idea. We continue to work with it. In some ways, it relates to the concept of resilience, which has
Mhm.
also been very popular in crisis response. But it really talks about learning and organizational learning or post-crisis learning. What can we learn from this event to assure that similar events don't happen again?
Right, right. And that's a powerful frame. I really like the way you looked at it. So you've consulted with Fortune 500 companies on crisis management, and you've seen this up close. And we would like to learn more from that. So what's the most common mistake organizations make when a crisis hits, and what should they do instead?
So, one of the most common things that organizations do when they experience a crisis is they contract. They become very insular.
Hmm.
They close off. They don't want information. They just want to, focus on the problem, and they do so by looking very internally. And really, one of the key components to successful crisis management is to maintain openness so
Hmm.
that you can have more information when it comes in. Organizations often become very, very defensive when a crisis occurs because reputational harm can be very devastating to a company, and it can be devastating to individuals who may be associated with that particular crisis. So this idea of becoming very defensive,
Hmm.
immediately issuing, explanations, maybe shifting blame, maybe accusing others of attacking them inappropriately. These can be very immediate responses, which actually make the crisis much worse going forward. So, I think that crises are threatening. They are and threatening. There's no doubt about it. They are uncertain. They we don't have all the information. Just because we don't have all the information doesn't mean we don't have to respond. We still have to respond. And crises require a short or immediate response. We don't have time to, spend 3 months studying the situation before we issue a response.
Mm-hmm.
We have to do so usually much more immediately.
Great, great. And that also points to the importance of the right mindset. So sometimes, we think that it's all about resources, whereas it's always about the right mindset, right? And that mindset is really what your academic work is trying to build, because crisis communication isn't just a skill. It's a whole discipline with its own frameworks and theories, as we can tell from your work. And this brings me to your book, Theorizing Crisis Communication. It brings together the major frameworks in the field, a wonderful, useful resource for our audiences. I would love for everybody to consult that. So for someone who has never thought about crisis communication as a discipline, what's the one idea from that work that would change how they see the next crisis that they live through?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say, it's important to recognize that bad things happen, and they happen every day. There's crises are occurring every day somewhere. And if we were to ask any audience, have you experienced a crisis? People will raise their hand. They'll talk about weather events. They'll talk about fires. They'll talk about emerging infectious diseases. They'll talk about, car accidents. Crises are part of human existence. And so we need to acknowledge that these things are going to happen, and we need to prepare accordingly. So once we acknowledge that something bad's going to happen, it's going to happen, then that necessitates that we think about, well, should this bad thing happen, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond? How will my organization respond? And then that may leverage the kinds of preparation and resources and training that is necessary for those circumstances. So I would say that that's, one of the key components to recognize. The other thing I would say is crises are very, very powerful change-inducing events. So again, when I started my research career in crisis communication, the image restoration literature was all about getting back to where we were as quickly as possible with as little harm as possible, and it's a very contained view of a crisis. That these are rare events. They happen, very sporadically. There's nothing we can do to avoid them. We just need to contain them and get past them as quickly as possible. But crises change the world. And, COVID-19 changed the world. 9/11 changed the world. The Indian Ocean tsunami changed the world. They changed societies. They changed people. They changed organizations. And so we need to think about these in a much broader way than these sort of narrow, contained little events that we're just going to get through.
And that leads to my final question, which is really about all of us, the public. The people on the receiving end of these messaging, the crisis communication messaging especially, and this is a big one. So after everything you've studied and everything you've lived through as a crisis communication scholar, what is the single most important thing you want the public to understand about how to navigate the next crisis?
Yes, so that's a big question. I appreciate it, and you mentioned as a scholar, I've also been through crises. I've learned from events by experiencing them. So I have experienced mass shooting events. I have experienced natural disasters, floods, fires, hurricanes, obviously the pandemic. So I have not only the academic experience, but as many people have, I also have the personal experience. So both of those in combination suggests to me that I need to recognize that these things happen with frequency and that I need to be prepared. I need to think about the things that are very uncomfortable to think about. It's not easy to think about, well, what would happen if my house flooded? How would I respond? And that's an overwhelming question. What would happen if a tornado came through my neighborhood and took my roof off? How would I respond to that? That's a huge question. So beginning to think about what is uncomfortable I think is very important, but also pushes us then toward the preparedness, to beginning to develop the resources, the relationships, the skills necessary to be able to manage those events successfully.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seeger. This has been such a rich and important conversation. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and everything you've contributed to this field. For our viewers, links to Dr. Seeger's work are in the description below. If this conversation resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll conclude by saying, stay curious, stay connected, keep asking questions, and see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.